I used to believe that summer watering was just something every gardener had to accept. Every morning I carried buckets across the yard, every evening I watched the soil dry out again, and every month the water bill kept climbing while my vegetables still looked tired. The strange part was that I thought I was doing everything right, but I was actually missing something that had been quietly helping gardeners long before electric pumps, plastic irrigation systems, and expensive equipment became common. Most people think the only water that matters is the water that comes from a hose or a tap, but that belief makes us ignore something. Nature gives away almost every single night without asking for anything in return. I learned this lesson many years ago from an older neighbor who never seemed worried when everyone else complained about dry weather. While the rest of us rushed outside before sunrise to soak our gardens, he simply smiled, walked slowly between his beds, and showed me something I had never noticed before. Every leaf, every piece of grass, and every smooth surface was covered with tiny drops of clear water. He looked at me and said that most gardeners step right over this free gift every morning without even seeing it. At first, I thought he was only talking about dew on the plants, but then he showed me a simple homemade collector built from ordinary materials that almost anyone already has around the house. There were no wires, no electricity, no noisy pumps, and no expensive parts. During the night, it quietly gathered moisture from the cool air while everyone was asleep, and by sunrise it had collected enough water to make a real difference in a vegetable garden over the course of a summer. I did not believe such a simple idea could change anything, but after trying it myself, I slowly noticed that I watered less often. The soil stayed moist longer, my tomatoes and peppers handled hot afternoons better, and I stopped worrying every time the weather forecast predicted another week without rain. The surprising part was not that the collector worked. The surprising part was how almost nobody around me seemed to know why it worked or how to make it properly, and that is exactly where the biggest mistake begins. When I built my first collector, I made the same mistake that almost everyone makes because I thought the bigger the surface, the more water I would collect. It sounded logical, but after several mornings I realized that size alone means very little if you ignore where the collector sits and how the night air actually behaves. Most people place homemade collectors where it is convenient, instead of where moisture naturally gathers. They leave them close to warm walls, under trees that block the open sky, or in places where the morning sun reaches too early. Then they decide the whole idea does not work when the real problem is simply the wrong location. I learned that cool air quietly settles in certain parts of the garden while warm air rises away, and those cooler places become small pockets where dew forms much more easily. Once I understood that simple fact, everything started changing. I stopped thinking about collecting water and started thinking about helping nature do what it already wanted to do every night. That old neighbor told me something I still remember every summer. He said you never fight the weather if you can work with it instead. Those words stayed with me because they proved true, again and again. I moved my collector into an open area where it could face the clear night sky and where the breeze could gently pass over it. I also kept it away from large concrete paths that stayed warm long after sunset, because that hidden warmth reduced the amount of dew that formed before dawn. Most people never notice details like these because they are looking for complicated solutions instead of simple habits. After only a few nights, I could already see more water gathering inside the container, and the difference became even more obvious during long stretches of dry weather. The amount collected each morning was not enough to replace every watering, and I never expected it to. That is another mistake people make. They expect one simple method to solve every problem. Instead, this old method quietly reduces the amount of water you need from other sources while helping the soil stay healthier over time. When you combine small daily savings through the entire summer, they become surprisingly valuable. But there was still one important detail that made my collector work much better than the first version, and that small improvement was something the older gardeners almost never forgot, even though very few people talk about it today. The improvement turned out to be so simple that I almost laughed when I first saw it. I expected some clever invention with special materials or complicated measurements, but the older man simply used a clean sheet of thin metal placed at a gentle angle above a small collection channel that led into an ordinary bucket. He told me that the surface itself was more important than the shape, because a smooth, cool surface encourages tiny drops of dew to join together until they become heavy enough to slide downward. Many people try using rough wood or old fabric because it seems easier, but those materials often hold the moisture instead of letting it flow into the container. That means part of the free water disappears again when the morning sun begins to warm everything. I copied his idea using materials I already had in my shed, and that first summer taught me more than any gardening book ever had. Every evening before going inside, I checked that the collector was clean and free from dust or fallen leaves, because even a thin layer of dirt can reduce how easily water moves across the surface. It only took a minute, yet that small habit made a noticeable difference over time. Little by little, I began collecting enough water to use on seedlings, herbs, and young vegetable plants that need gentle watering around their roots. I never wasted a single drop because water gathered from dew felt different to me. It was completely free and arrived without pumps, hoses, electricity, or fuel. That alone changed how I looked at my entire garden. Instead of asking how much water I needed to buy or pump, I started asking how much water nature was already offering if I simply paid attention. Most gardeners never reach that point because they give up after only a few mornings when they expect the bucket to be full. That is not how this old method works. It rewards patience and consistency rather than speed. Night after night, the small amounts add together, especially during warm summers when the difference between daytime heat and cool nights creates excellent conditions for dew. The collector became a part of my normal routine without adding extra work. I simply emptied it each morning before breakfast and let it begin collecting again when evening arrived. Then I noticed another unexpected benefit that had nothing to do with the amount of water itself. The way I watered my garden also began to change, and that was where the real savings started to appear because most people lose far more water during the day than they ever realize. Once I had a steady supply of dew water each morning, I realized that using it wisely mattered just as much as collecting it. Many gardeners pour water across the entire bed until the surface looks wet, but only a small part of that moisture actually reaches the roots before the sun begins taking it back into the air. I used to do exactly the same thing, and I never questioned it because everyone around me watered that way. Then the older gardener showed me another habit that almost nobody follows anymore. He never watered the whole garden unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, he gave a slow drink only where each plant truly needed it. A small amount placed carefully around the root zone often did more good than a large amount sprayed everywhere. That lesson changed my routine completely. Every morning, I carried the bucket from my dew collector and walked quietly through the garden while the air was still cool. I poured a little water around my tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans, and young lettuce instead of soaking empty soil between the rows. The plants stayed healthier because the moisture reached the roots before the heat arrived, and I noticed fewer weeds because I was no longer watering places where nothing useful was growing. That alone saved time later because fewer weeds meant less pulling and less competition for valuable moisture. Another old habit I adopted was covering the soil with a simple layer of dry grass, straw, or shredded leaves after watering. Many people think mulch is only for keeping weeds down, but I discovered it quietly protects every drop of water you give the soil. The ground underneath stayed cooler for much longer, and even after several hot afternoons I could still feel damp earth beneath the mulch, while uncovered areas had already become dry and dusty. The free water collected during the night lasted much longer because it was protected instead of exposed. That combination of a simple collector and good mulch created results that surprised me all summer. I was not adding expensive equipment or spending more hours working. I was simply wasting less of what nature had already provided. Few people connect these two old methods together, yet they work far better as a pair than they do separately. Even then, there was one small detail that made the collector produce noticeably more water on certain nights, and once I understood that final adjustment, I stopped thinking of it as a clever project and started treating it as a dependable part of my garden every single summer. One evening, I almost moved the collector because I thought a different corner of the garden would give me better results, but I decided to leave it where it was for one more week. That simple decision taught me an important lesson that I still follow today. Most gardeners change too many things too quickly. They move the collector after one dry night, they change the angle the next evening, and then they replace the material before they have given any method enough time to prove itself. Nature does not behave exactly the same every night. Some mornings the collector will surprise you with a generous amount of water, while on other mornings there may only be a small layer waiting in the bottom of the container. That is completely normal. I stopped judging the method by a single night and started looking at the whole week instead. That small change in thinking made me appreciate how dependable the collector really was. Another detail that many people ignore is keeping the collecting surface clean. Dust, pollen, bird droppings, and even a few dry leaves can interrupt the smooth path that tiny drops of water follow as they join together. Every few days, I simply wiped the surface with a damp cloth and checked that the small channel leading into the bucket was completely clear. It took less time than filling a watering can, yet it protected all the work the collector was doing while I slept. I also discovered that placing the collector where it could cool naturally under the open night sky worked much better than placing it beneath branches or beside buildings that stayed warm after sunset. Few people think about this because they focus only on convenience instead of performance. The older gardeners understood that the night sky itself helps cool the surface enough for dew to form, and that forgotten observation is still true today. As the weeks passed, I noticed another unexpected result. Because I had even a small supply of free water available each morning, I became much more careful with every other source of water I used. I no longer reached for the hose automatically. I checked the soil first, looked under the mulch, and often discovered the plants did not need nearly as much as I once believed. That simple habit probably saved more water than the collector itself. But there was one final lesson that brought all these old methods together and turned them into a routine I have repeated every summer since, and once you understand that lesson, you will see your garden in a completely different way. By the end of that first summer, I realized the biggest reward was not the extra bucket of water waiting for me each morning. The real reward was the peace of mind that came with knowing I had become less dependent on expensive solutions and less worried every time another hot week appeared in the weather forecast. I was no longer rushing outside in the evening thinking I had to rescue my vegetables before they dried out. The soil stayed cooler under its layer of mulch, the roots received gentle watering early in the morning, and every small amount of dew I collected became part of a larger habit that made the entire garden stronger. That is something many people overlook because they search for one miracle product instead of building several simple habits that quietly support each other. I have shown this method to friends and neighbors over the years, and almost every one of them reacted the same way. At first they smiled politely because the idea sounded too simple to matter. A homemade collector made from ordinary materials does not look impressive beside modern irrigation systems with timers, pumps, and long rows of plastic tubing. Yet after a few weeks, many of those same people told me they were using less water than before and spending less time dragging hoses around the garden. Their vegetables looked healthier because they stopped flooding the soil and started paying attention to where every drop was going. That is a lesson worth remembering, because water is often lost through careless habits rather than a lack of supply. I also noticed something else that surprised me. The more carefully I observed my garden each morning while emptying the collector, the earlier I spotted small problems. I noticed leaves beginning to curl, insects appearing on young plants, or soil becoming slightly too dry before those issues turned into larger ones. The collector gave me a reason to walk through the garden every sunrise instead of only visiting when something had already gone wrong. Those quiet morning walks became one of my favorite parts of the day. They reminded me that good gardening is rarely about rushing or spending more money. It is usually about paying closer attention to simple things that many people ignore. That old forgotten method gave me more than free water. It taught me patience, observation, and respect for the small gifts nature offers every single night. There is one final lesson that ties all of this together, and once you hear it, you may never look at a summer morning in quite the same way again. The longer I use this simple dew collector, the more convinced I become that the greatest value is not the water itself, but the way it changes the person who cares for the garden. You begin to notice the weather instead of fighting it. You stop believing that every solution must cost money. You understand that many of the old methods survived because they worked quietly year after year without needing electricity, fuel, expensive equipment, or constant repairs. My vegetable garden still needs rain, and I still water it during long dry periods. But now, every free drop collected through the night becomes another small step towards saving water and protecting the soil. Those small steps add together over an entire season until the difference becomes impossible to ignore. The ground stays moist longer. The vegetables suffer less during hot afternoons. I spend less time carrying hoses from one bed to another. Even the simple habit of checking the collector every morning reminds me to walk slowly through the garden and look carefully at every plant before problems become serious. That quiet routine has become just as valuable as the water itself. If you decide to build your own collector, do not expect miracles after the first night. Give it time. Watch how different nights produce different amounts of moisture. Keep the surface clean. Place it where the open night sky can cool it properly. Protect your soil with mulch so every collected drop works harder for you. Most importantly, remember that no single method creates a perfect garden. A healthy garden is built from many small habits repeated patiently throughout the season. That is exactly how older gardeners worked, because they understood that nature rewards consistency far more than speed. I hope this forgotten method helps you save water, reduce unnecessary work, and enjoy your mornings a little more than before. Once you begin seeing those tiny drops of dew as free water instead of something that disappears with the sunrise, you may never look at your garden in quite the same way again. And next time I will show you another forgotten method that works together with this one to keep moisture in the soil even during the hottest weeks of summer, because most gardeners are still making one simple mistake that slowly dries out their garden every single day.